What if death were not the end, but merely the gateway to a dimension where your body no longer belongs to you? That is basically the idea behind the movie The Void from 2016. Because this movie is not simply about secret cults or people trying to survive nightmares made of flesh, blood, and tentacles. All of that is there, of course, and it is part of its identity. But deep down, The Void is about something far more disturbing: the possibility that there is a reality on the other side of death. A dimension capable of deforming flesh, altering the mind, breaking space, and offering a form of immortality that, in reality, feels much more like a condemnation than a salvation. And this place is not the void understood as absolute nothingness. It is not simply a place of solitude, nor is it a hell as we traditionally understand it. And it is definitely not an alien world filled with strange creatures. It is more like a plane of existence separate from our own, an incomprehensible dimension where life, death, the body, and time obey completely different rules. That is why the movie works so well as cosmic horror, because it never gives us a clear explanation. No one ever appears to say exactly what the Black Pyramid is, who built it, what entities live there, or what real purpose that dimension serves. What it does is much more effective. It lets us see the consequences of staring for too long into that other side. And those consequences are horrifying. The story begins at night, on an isolated farmhouse. A man named James escapes desperately, covered in blood, while a woman tries to flee with him. But before she can escape, she is caught by two men, Vincent and Simon, a father and his son. At first, they are presented as simple killers. They murder her, douse her with gasoline, and burn her body as if they wanted to erase any trace of her and their crime. But this detail, although it seems like nothing more than a display of brutality, is one of the first important clues the movie gives us. It turns out that Vincent and Simon do not burn the corpse only out of hatred or cruelty. They do it because they have already seen what happens when someone dies under the influence of the void. They have learned that in this story, death does not always stop a person. Sometimes death only leaves the body empty for something else to use. And that is one of the central concepts of the movie. The human body to the void is not sacred. It is not an identity, and it is not a person. It is only biological building material that can be opened, reactivated, and reshaped again. Returning to the story, while James manages to escape into the woods, a figure dressed in a white robe watches from the darkness. A black triangle can be seen on its face, a symbol that from this moment on becomes a kind of warning. That triangle is not just the emblem of a cult. It is the representation of something much greater. It is a ritual mark, a sign of the Black Pyramid, and probably also a reference to the door that connects our reality with that nightmare dimension. Now, as happens in many cosmic horror stories, the symbol is never fully explained, and that is precisely why it works, because human beings need to understand what they see. They need to give it a name, a shape, and a logic. But the void does not operate according to our logic. From the beginning, the movie makes it clear that its characters are not facing a problem they can solve or understand, but a nightmare they will barely survive. After this scene, we meet Daniel Carter, a small-town police officer patrolling a quiet road at night. Everything seems normal, even routine, until James appears stumbling out of the woods. Daniel does not know who he is, where he comes from, or what happened at the farmhouse. From his point of view, James looks like an injured man, perhaps drugged or drunk. So he does the only reasonable thing: he takes him to the nearest hospital. That hospital is Marsh County Hospital. And from the moment Daniel arrives, the place already feels strange, because the building is half abandoned because of a recent fire. Many resources have been removed, the staff is minimal, and several areas are in the process of being moved out. In other words, it is the perfect setting for a survival horror story, with few characters, dark hallways, locked doors, limited supplies, and a threat that begins to surround everything. Inside the hospital, we meet Allison, Daniel's estranged wife. There is still a little affection between them, but also a very painful distance. Later on, we understand that they both lost a child during pregnancy, and that loss destroyed their relationship. There are also Beverly, a nurse, Kim, a young intern with little real experience, Maggie, a pregnant teenager, Ben, her grandfather, and Dr. Richard Powell, who who at first seems like a calm, rational, and even compassionate figure. Powell knows Daniel, he knows Allison, and he knows what happened to them. In fact, when he speaks with Daniel, he mentions his own loss. His daughter Sarah died, and that tragedy nearly destroyed him. And that is why, at this point, Powell seems like a man who understands other people's pain. He seems like someone who has suffered and who, in some way, is trying to help. But here is the trap. Powell never accepted his daughter's death. He never moved on, and he never healed his wound. He only hid his obsession behind the mask of a doctor. And that obsession will become the center of this entire story. The first real explosion of horror happens when Daniel finds Beverly attacking a patient. She has stabbed him in the eye with a pair of scissors and is cutting the skin off her face while repeating that this is not her face. And pay attention to this, because that phrase is very important. Because Beverly is not simply acting like a possessed person. It seems as if her identity has fragmented, as if something had shown her that her body no longer belongs to her. She looks at her own face and does not recognize it, as if human flesh were nothing more than a temporary mask, something that can be opened, replaced, or modified by an external force. Daniel tries to stop her, but in the end, he is forced to shoot her, and Beverly dies. Or at least that is what should happen in the normal world. But the void does not take place in a normal world. After the shock of shooting her, Daniel begins to have visions of a landscape he does not understand. Dark clouds, organic shapes, a cosmic presence, and a gigantic black pyramid emerging in a reality that does not seem to belong to ours. That is his first contact with the void. And basically, this is where the movie begins to reveal that what is happening is not something ordinary. We are not talking about a virus or a bacterium or an experiment that went out of control. The void seems to function as an influence, a signal, or an energy that seeps in from another dimension and affects everything it touches: the mind, the body, space, and death. Something similar to the signal of the markers from Dead Space. That is why Beverly does not simply go insane. That is why her corpse does not stay dead. That is why Daniel begins to have visions and convulsions, because the hospital was already contaminated by the void. Shortly afterwards, Mitchell arrives, a state trooper who was investigating the massacre at the farmhouse. From his perspective, everything has a more or less human explanation. His hypothesis is that James is a criminal, that he was probably drugged, that he may have caused the violence at the farmhouse, and that perhaps he also caused what happened to Beverly. But that explanation does not last long. Daniel tries to go out to the patrol car to call for help, but he discovers that the communications are not working. Then he sees one of the cultists dressed in white. This figure does not speak and does not answer his questions. It simply attacks him and stabs him. Daniel manages to get it off him and return to the hospital, wounded, and then everyone realizes that the building is surrounded by more cultists. Now there is an interesting detail here. The cultists do not seem to be trying to get in. Rather, they seem to be preventing the others from getting out, as if their function were to keep everyone inside the hospital until something happens. And from that moment on, the story changes. The danger is no longer only outside, it is also inside. Because Beverly's body begins to move and transform. The dead nurse becomes a grotesque creature, a mass of flesh, organs, and tentacles that no longer has a clear human form. And this transformation shows us one of the movie's most important rules. The void does not resurrect people as they were before, but corrupts them. It seems as if it were trying to reconstruct a human body without really understanding what a human body is. That is why tentacles appear where limbs should be, exposed organs where there should be skin, flesh growing out of control like tumors, in forms that seem to be being born and rotting at the same time. And that is one of the most terrifying ideas in the void, because normally we think of death as the end. Tragic, yes, but still the end. Here, however, death can simply be the moment when the body becomes available for something else. That is why the creatures are not presented as traditional zombies, because they are not really living dead in the classic sense. They are human bodies possessed and altered by a force that does not understand human anatomy, or that simply does not care to preserve it, and the result is a nightmare. In the middle of the chaos, Vincent and Simon reappear, the two men from the farmhouse. They arrive at the hospital looking for James, and at first they seem like just another threat. They are armed, violent, and they want to kill him. But their arrival also causes the situation to spiral even further out of control. James, completely terrified, takes Maggie hostage with a scalpel. And in that moment, Powell tries to approach him to calm him down, still acting as if he were the reasonable doctor of the group. But James knows something the others still do not understand. To him, Powell is not an innocent doctor. He is the man behind the farmhouse, the cult, and the transformations he had already witnessed. That is why, when Powell gets too close, James stabs him in the neck. In that instant, everyone believes the doctor has died. They leave him on the floor, cover his body, and for a moment, it seems as if Powell has left the story. But in reality, the exact opposite happens. His death does not stop him. Later on, we will discover that this attack was, in some way, the step that allowed him to begin his own transformation. Because for Powell, dying is not the end of his plan. It is part of the process. And that is precisely why it gradually becomes clear that Vincent and Simon are not the real enemies either. Vincent lost his family at the hands of Powell's cult, and Simon was one of the few who managed to survive that massacre. The movie does not show exactly everything that happened, but it does make it clear that the attack marked them forever. Vincent was consumed by guilt, while Simon ended up wounded, traumatized, and practically closed off inside himself. That is why Vincent protects him in such a violent way, and that is why, later on, the Void can use that tragedy against them, forcing them to relive the moment their family was murdered. Now that experience also explains why they act as if they already know some of the rules of this nightmare. They know that bodies must be burned. They know that death does not always stop the creatures, and although they do not fully understand what the Void is, they understand enough to know that they cannot allow those things to continue existing. When Beverly's creature attacks and drags Mitchell away, Vincent and Simon help destroy it. Meanwhile, Maggie, the pregnant teenager, begins to feel pain. Allison believes there may be a serious complication and needs to go look for medical supplies. Daniel tries to stop her from going alone, but the situation is so desperate that the group splits up. Daniel, Vincent, and Simon go outside to look for a shotgun in the patrol car. And here, another strange detail occurs. The car seems to be much farther away than it should be. This could have a simple explanation. Maybe the cultists moved it to make it harder for them to escape, or to force them to remain inside the hospital. But at the same time, the movie uses this moment as an early sign that something around the building is no longer functioning normally. It may not yet be clear proof of dimensional manipulation, but it does prepare the idea that the space around the hospital is beginning to behave in a strange way. While Daniel and the others are outside, Allison goes ahead to look for the medical supplies. And that is the mistake that puts her directly in Powell's hands. He is the one who reveals the truth. Dr. Richard Powell did not die when James attacked him. His body has begun to transform, but his mind is still functioning. In fact, Powell seems fascinated by his own transformation. As a doctor, he spent his life opening bodies, repairing them, and studying them. But now his own body becomes the final experiment. And then we understand his motivation. For reasons that are not explained in the movie, Powell had lost his daughter Sarah. That loss destroyed him. But instead of accepting her death, he became obsessed with defeating it. He looked for a solution in places where no one should ever look, and what he found was the Void. What is interesting is that Powell does not consider himself a villain. He believes he is saving humanity. He believes death is an absurd limitation, a flaw of nature, and a boundary that can be crossed. From his point of view, his experiments are acts of compassion. He does not believe he is torturing people. He believes he is preparing them for a higher form of existence. But that is where the horror lies, because Powell confuses continuity with salvation. Yes, the Void can make someone continue to exist after death, but what comes back is no longer human in any recognizable way. It is a reactivated mass of flesh adapted to foreign laws, living an existence in which it can keep moving, growing, and obeying, but has lost almost everything that made that person a person. In other words, Powell did not find eternal life. He found a way to prevent death from finishing its work, and that makes it much worse. Death in the Void stops being a way out and becomes a transition into something that can use your body, your pain, and your desires to force its way into our world. While Allison is trapped with Powell, Daniel, Vincent, Simon, and James decide to go down to the basement to look for her. Kim tries to guide them by radio, but very quickly realizes that something does not fit. The door that should be there does not appear. The hallways do not match the real structure of the hospital. There are stairs that should not exist. Because of this, the sub-basement seems to function as an intermediate zone between our reality and the void. And the deeper they go, the more everything becomes distorted. And it is precisely in that impossible zone that the true consequences of Powell's experiments begin to appear. Because the doctor did not master the void from the beginning, before his great ritual, before using Maggie as a vessel, and before trying to bring Sarah back, Powell made mistakes. Many mistakes. Some of his first creations remained in that sub-basement. Deformed human bodies trapped between life and death, turned into creatures that can no longer return to what they were, but also cannot fully die. And here there is an important detail. Those creatures do not seem to be evil in the classic sense. They are not monsters because they want to cause harm, but because they were turned into something they never asked to be. They are victims trapped in impossible bodies, beings that suffer, that writhe, and that, according to Powell himself, want to die. But he does not let them, because to him, they are no longer people. They are tests. They are necessary mistakes. They are failed steps on his path toward true resurrection. In fact, it is implied that some of those first creatures were responsible for the fire that left the hospital half abandoned. In other words, the disaster that turned Marsh County Hospital into the perfect place for the ritual was not just any accident, but a direct consequence of the doctor's failed experiments, because those same experiments were trying to die. So when Daniel, Vincent, Simon, and James descend through that labyrinth, they are not only entering a hidden part of the hospital, they are entering Powell's playground, a place full of broken bodies, incomplete transformations, and monsters that prove the void does not offer salvation. It only turns suffering into something eternal. In addition, James reveals that Powell and his cult previously used the farmhouse as a kind of church. They attracted vulnerable people, especially addicts, and forced them to participate in or witness rituals, sacrifices, and transformations. And this is where the cult becomes more interesting, since they are not simply fanatics inventing a religion. They are people who have seen a part of a higher reality, but they do not have the ability to understand it. So they do what humans usually do when faced with the incomprehensible. They create symbols, rituals, hierarchies, and promises. The triangle becomes their mark. The black pyramid becomes their divine image, and Powell becomes their prophet. But as usually happens in cosmic horror, just because something seems divine does not mean it is good. Sometimes it only means that it is too big for us. And basically, that is what the void represents. A force so ancient and alien that humans interpret it as salvation, when in reality, perhaps they are only opening a door to something that should never have touched our world. But as the group moves through the labyrinth, the void begins to attack in another way. Not only with creatures, but with guilt. That is why Vincent begins to see his dead family, and that vision drags him toward one of his deepest wounds, the idea that Simon was unable to protect them. For a moment, Vincent loses control and blames his own son, but that rage is not only his, because the void was amplifying it and using it to turn it into a trap. And the same thing happens with Daniel, because he also resented the loss of his son, which is why he had separated from Allison. And even worse, he carries a secret guilt, an emotion he does not want to acknowledge. Powell suggests that, in the moment of the loss, Daniel felt relief. Not because he did not love his son, but because perhaps he felt terrified or overwhelmed. And that idea destroys him from within. And it is also one of the reasons why Powell manages to manipulate people, because he does not seduce them with power first. Rather, he seduces them with comfort, with the promise that what had been lost could return, with the idea that pain and loss do not have to be final. And of course, when someone is completely broken by loss, a promise like that can sound like salvation. But it is not. It is bait. While all of this is happening below, upstairs, the situation with Maggie gets worse. Kim tries to help her, but the truth is soon revealed. Maggie is not just a pregnant teenager trapped in this horror. Maggie is actually part of the cult too. She kills her own grandfather and makes it clear that the approaching birth is not something natural. She is not carrying an ordinary baby inside her. This is because her body had been prepared for some time as a vessel to bring back Sarah, Powell's dead daughter. And with this, the movie brings together all of its main themes. Allison lost a child. Daniel carries that loss. Vincent lost his family. Powell lost Sarah. And Maggie carries inside her a supposed new life that would end up being an abomination created by the void. Here, the movie turns motherhood, birth, and resurrection into something deeply disturbing, because what Powell wants to present as a miracle is not a miracle. It is a perversion of life itself and a grotesque imitation of resurrection. When Daniel finally finds Allison, he sees her on a table. He has a vision of her pregnant, but when he returns to reality, her body is invaded by tentacles, and she practically no longer seems human. Powell tells him that he has given her what she wanted and that now she is a mother. And this scene is brutal because it completely twists Allison's trauma. She lost her child, and Powell uses that wound to justify his experiment. He believes he is helping her. He believes he is giving back something she lost. But Daniel only sees one thing. The woman he loves turned into a horrible creature. So he takes an axe and attacks her, convinced that he is ending her suffering. Now this is where the movie becomes more ambiguous, because in the end, we will see Allison apparently whole, standing with Daniel in the dimension of the Black Pyramid. So what did Daniel really kill? Did he kill Allison's transformed body? Did he kill an illusion? Or did he only destroy the incomprehensible form that his human mind was able to perceive? An interesting theory is that when the void takes a person, that person begins to exist on two planes at the same time. In our world, we see the deformed part transformed into grotesque creatures. But in the dimension of the Black Pyramid, perhaps something more like their essence, their consciousness, or their soul remains. Maybe that is why Allison appears intact at the end, because perhaps only her body was transformed on Earth, but something of her had already crossed over to the other side. Although this does not mean she is saved. On the contrary, it means she is trapped on that plane. Because if the void is a dimension where death stops functioning as a way out, then Allison did not find rest there. She only found a prison. Finally, Daniel reaches the ritual chamber and faces Powell. By this point, the doctor is no longer completely human. His body had changed, but his mind is still there. And that makes him more dangerous and terrifying than the other creatures. In addition, he still thinks that everything he did makes sense. He no longer speaks like a doctor. He speaks more like a prophet. He says that he refuses to accept that death is the end, because there are things older than time itself, that those things have blessed him, and that now at last he is going to get his daughter back. Then he opens the door. The triangle lights up like a portal to a different reality. The cultists gather to witness the birth, and Maggie gives birth to what Powell believes will be Sarah. But what she gives birth to is not a girl. It is a monster, an amorphous creature of flesh, bone, and tentacles that makes sounds like those of a human baby. And this moment confirms a rather cruel truth that I already mentioned earlier. Powell did manage to bring something back, but he did not manage to recover his daughter as such. The creature attacks Daniel, but Vincent and Simon arrive and lure it away to try to stop it. But Vincent ends up trapped by it. However, he manages to cover himself in fuel and asks Simon to burn him along with the monster. This is a tragic ending, but also a very coherent one. Vincent began the movie by burning bodies to prevent the boy from using them, and he ends by applying that same rule to himself in order to protect his son. Powell still tries to tempt Daniel. He promises to give Allison back to him and tells him that she is waiting for him, that he only has to let himself go, that he can be with her again. And here lies the true contrast between Daniel and Powell, because they both lost something. They both know the pain of grief. They both have a reason to want death not to be final. But Powell turned his grief into fanaticism. Daniel, on the other hand, ultimately understands that accepting loss is better than allowing that thing known as the void to keep entering our world. In the end, Daniel does not fully understand the pyramid, or the abyss, or the rules of that dimension, but he does understand something much simpler. Powell is using people's pain as a key to open a door that should never have been opened. That is why Daniel attacks Powell and pushes him toward the portal, because he understands that if that door stays open, everything will eventually cross over. And perhaps the boundary between our world and the dimension of the Black Pyramid could break completely. That is why Daniel sacrifices himself to close the abyss. Meanwhile, Simon tries to escape from that intermediate dimension, but the creature Powell believes is Sarah is still chasing him. By this point, the ritual has already been interrupted, and the portal begins to close and collapse in on itself. The walls contract, the corridors deform, and Simon barely manages to make it back to the hospital before he is trapped. The creature, however, fails to get out. The space closes in on it, crushing it as the door between both worlds finishes sealing. After that, Simon and Kim manage to leave the hospital at dawn. They are the only ones who seem to return to our reality. The horror is over, at least for now, but the movie does not end with them. It ends with Daniel and Allison. They both appear holding hands in that strange dimension, facing a gigantic black pyramid suspended in a dark and unreal landscape. That place is the void, and that final image is the key to understanding the entire movie. Because this finally shows us that the void is not a pyramid. It is not just a source of monsters. It is a realm, a dimension, perhaps a prison, perhaps a temple, perhaps the home of entities far older than humanity. The Black Pyramid could be many things: a sacred structure, a machine, a door, a symbol, or even the physical manifestation of something the human mind simply cannot process. But what we do know is that it is connected to death. In the end, Daniel and Allison do not look at the Black Pyramid like people who have found answers. They look at it like small lost beings, trapped in front of something too vast to understand. And that is where the true cosmic horror lies. It is not in knowing exactly what the void is, but in understanding that it exists and that we are insignificant to it. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one. Hey, don't go just yet. If you enjoyed this video, I've got another one I think you'll love. Check it out.